If you've ever seen the movie Shrek, then you know that the donkey is the most entertaining character in the whole movie, in the whole movie series. And in fact, it's what I think of when I hear about this today's obscure character in the Bible. And every time I think about or hear about the story of Balaam from Numbers 22 in the Old Testament, I cannot help but think picture the prophet as Shrek and the donkey as Eddie Murphy. Now, we'll get to that story in just a second, but did you know that Peter references this story of the talking donkey in 2 Peter chapter 2? Peter uses that story to teach an important lesson to Christians who are feeling the pressure from culture to turn their back on God in an effort to be more accepted in the world. That sounds like today's culture too. We do a lot of that. And in chapters 1 and 3 of 2 Peter, Peter reminds us that the Bible is true. And then in chapter 2, he reminds us that there will be great opposition to and even pressure on those who persist in believing what God says. The spirits at work behind culture, here's the truth, they never change. And so we face the same three kinds of pressure that they did in the New Testament, that they did in the Old Testament. We face those pressures today. Number one, pride. The enemies of God's word, as Peter says, are bold and willful. We also face the public. The enemy of God's word, they don't hide or reserve their rebellion to the evening. Instead, they revel in the daytime, Peter says, and then profit. The enemies of God's word have hearts trained in greed. Maybe you feel you have wandered away from God through one of those three things. Maybe you feel like you've compromised your own convictions in the last few years. Or maybe you just feel like you just plain blown it with your life. Hey, there is hope. First, just look at Peter, who wrote this book after he denied Jesus 3 times. But Jesus still forgave him. And then looking back to Numbers 22, look at that original story. There's this prophet Balaam. He was supposed to be a prophet for God, and he was supposed to say what God said and bless those who God blessed. But a godless Moabite king who hated God and God's people because he was in fear for his kingdom, he sought to turn the prophet into a prophet for hire, in essence, by offering a hefty profit. And as the king kept adding zeros to the check, eventually he found the price for Balaam's ministry. If your soul is for sale, the moral of the immoral story is that Satan will keep adding zeros until he finds your asking price. So the prophet Balaam jumps on his donkey, and here's what happens, and rides out to curse God's people and prophesy some lies. But to stop him, the angel of the Lord comes down from heaven and stands in the road. And when the angel of the Lord, when that phrase is used in the Old Testament, it's talking about the presence of God. And it was the same presence that spoke to Abram. It was the same presence that Jacob wrestled with and then got renamed to Israel. It's the same presence that spoke to Moses at the burning bush. And here it is again in the road. The prophet did not see Jesus or the presence of God, but the donkey did. And in an ironic twist, the donkey is more discerning and aware of God's presence than the prophet is. The donkey veers off course, seeking to avoid hitting the presence of God, Satan, in the middle of the road. And the prophet gets angry and starts beating the animal. And then in yet another ironic twist, the prophet is not troubled by his rebellion against God, but is greatly troubled by the donkey's defiance of him. The donkey then turns around and talks out loud, and he rebukes the prophet. Yes, the prophet is now a false prophet, and the donkey is the true prophet. Balaam repents. He changes his ways, but he does not give in to the terror or temptation that was in his culture. And he is restored to ministry just as Peter was. Are you currently, or have you ever rebelled against God and gotten off course? How has God used creative ways like a talking donkey, or even comedic ways? We think that's Eddie Murphy's voice in that talking donkey to Balaam. How has he used those ways to correct you and redirect you? We want to hear about it. Tell us about it. We want to hear your story about how God has changed your life.